see everybody out again. So tonight we're talking about the Comanche, but of course I have to tell you what I left out last week first. And this is what I've heard is an apocryphal story, but I really like it because it kind of, oh, come on. There we go. I like it because it kind of encapsulates the viewpoint of both the Native Americans, the Sioux, and how many white people felt. So this is a story about how Red Cloud, by the way, I didn't mention last week that the name, we actually know why he was named Red Cloud, and that was because when he was born, there was apparently a meteor going across the sky. And so they saw that and said, well, Red Cloud. So, anyway, so in 1870, Red Cloud was visiting the White House. And he was, while visiting there, he was talking with a soldier who was stationed there. And they were discussing the Black Hills. And he was trying to convince the soldier that the Black Hills were sacred to the Sioux. And so he said, my ancestors' bones are buried there. So the officer looked at him and said, horse shit. Your people come from Minnesota, and you were born in Nebraska. You took that land from the Crows because you could. Do you know why we will take that land from you? Because we can. And so Red Cloud tried to tell him also about, we had mentioned the caves there, and how he believed that their ancestors, the first people, were created by their gods and came up out of those caves. And so that's why it was so sacred to them. So, anyway, moving on. Hello, get your hand up there. So, our featured Native American is Cynthia Parker. Does that name ring any bells to anybody? Okay. It's kind of a shame, as I've said before, it's sometimes odd which names come down to us that everybody knows as household names and which ones don't. And it's kind of a shame that there aren't a number of Comanche names that are familiar to everybody, like the Sioux. Everybody knows Sitting Bull, and everybody knows the Apache, Geronimo, but you don't know any Comanche names. So anyway, the Comanche, our bibliography for today, this first one is the one that I would recommend as wonderful summer reading. It's a very exciting work. The guy won numerous awards. It was Pulitzer Prize finalist. Didn't win the Pulitzer, but it was a finalist. So, and this is, it talks about the rise and fall of the Comanche, and Cynthia Parker is like the featured Native American in that book. So he goes back and forth between describing Cynthia Parker's life and the Comanches as a whole. Very good work. This next one, The Captured. As the title indicates, it's about people who were captured by the Comanches, or Native American tribes in that area. Sometimes it's Apaches. But this is a guy who is a descendant, or the great-great-great nephew of someone who was captured. And so he writes the story about the capture of his ancestor, along with many others. So it's not just one story, but it's very well written, and it kind of, it shows you, it showed me that each individual incident was unique. Sometimes I try to tell you about stories that are indicative of how it always happened, but there really is no story that is indicative of how it always happened, because they're all very unique. Sometimes someone was captured, some kid out in the field tending to the sheep, and some braves come along, pick him up, and take him away, and never disturb the household. Other times they come in and they kill everybody and take 2 or 3 kids or women or whatever. But like I said, it's always different. And the next one, 9 Years with the Indians. The title kind of tells you it all. This is by the author, Herman Lehman, that he had been captured as a kid and was with them for 9 years. Very interesting story. It's rather short, only 138 pages, but it's very well written. Not a lot of flowery language or anything, but it's always direct and to the point, and very harrowing, as they all are. This next one, Lone Star, about the history of Texas. Very well written. Apparently there was a PBS miniseries that was done on this book. It's quite a work, 761 pages. So if you're ambitious enough to want to know that much about Texas, it's worth reading. This last one, who can identify where this guy's from?
Finland.
What?
Finland.
Very good. You knew that. I'm impressed. So this guy from Finland is an American now. I believe he's a citizen. But last week I talked about how I would wish that Sitting Bull had a great biography, because the one that I read was only good. This is a survey of Comanche history. This is a great book. I'm not an expert on the Comanches. I'm not really an expert on much of anything. But I know a great book when I read one. This is a great book. It won all kinds of awards, as it should. And it's very well worth reading. 500 pages, so it's not short either. But a really great work of history. And that's really the reviews that you read that are on this book kind of tell you that's what they really look for. That the scholarship is just amazing. It gives you a whole different view of what the Comanches were like and their impact in history. So, the first that we knew of the Comanches, they were up in Wyoming, probably wandering many different places, but in Wyoming, prior to European contact, they were a small, insignificant band that scratched out a living out in the plains of Wyoming. They eventually broke away from the Shoshones, and their Comanche name, as you can see up there, an interesting one, Fights Me All the Time, which is very indicative of the Comanche. They didn't get this early on. This was much later, I think, because the Utes were originally friends of theirs. They were allies early on, the first that we knew of them. Their name were the people, like almost all Native American tribes were called, or called themselves. They called themselves the people, which in Comanche was Numunu. So the first recorded contact that we know was from the Spanish, that they recorded that the Navajos, or the Utes, were allied with this new group, that they may be attacking us sometime soon. But the Pueblo Revolt is really where they got started in the big time. The Comanches as all Native American tribes were on their feet. There were no horses to ride in pre-Columbian America. So in 1680, the Great Pueblo Revolt, the Spanish had dominated the Pueblo Indians, or the Navajos and the Hopis, and for close to 100 years. And they had had enough of the cruelty of the Spanish, and so they revolted in 1680, killed a bunch of Spanish, kicked them out. And at that time, a lot of them, the Pueblo Indians were not really horsemen. They didn't use the horses like the Spanish did, and so many of the horses at that time escaped. Many hundreds, if not thousands, out onto the plains. And the horses loved being out there, and they bred and they expanded. It was also at that time that the Comanches, with the Utes, discovered horses and that they could be ridden. And the Comanches took to them like a fish in water. They loved and very quickly became masters of the horse. So here's Comanche Territory in Wyoming originally, and they migrated down. New Mexico is where the Spanish settlements were, and the Pueblo Indians, where they revolted. They had hooked up with the Utes as allies, and they got to ride horses. And that was a great transformation for them. Not only did they love riding horses, they could breed them. They knew how to take care of them. They knew how to breed for endurance. They knew how to breed for carrying packs, and they knew how to train them. Or they developed this among themselves. Truly remarkable story. If we could know exactly how that came about, it would be amazing. But of course, we just know that it happened. But to be truly a horse tribe, they had to have the right ratio. Among the Plains Indians, the Comanche, more than any other Plains Indians, developed or bred their horses so well that they had eventually a 4-to-1 ratio for every man, woman, and child in their tribe. Most tribes would have, at best, a 1-to-1 ratio. The Comanches had much more because that's what they were all about. And one of the amazing things about the Comanche as they rode their horses that many people noted that no one else could do, they could grab onto the side of the horse. They apparently had some strap for their foot, and they could straddle on the side of the horse. You see how he's shooting his arrow right above the neck? They were the first and mostly the only tribe that would hunt and fight battles on the horse. Most tribes that had horses, they used the horses for transport, and they could ride from one place to another, but then they would get off the horse to fight because it's so difficult to shoot an arrow when you're on top of a horse, especially when you're riding it. The Comanches could do that. They dedicated themselves, and not only could they do that, but they could shoot from the side of the horse, and they could even, reportedly, shoot under the neck of the horse.
Jeez.
And this was something that was just so remarkable that people would note about the Comanches. Now the next one, I'm going to get into Comanche names. I'm hoping we're all over 18 here, because some of these names are kind of R-rated. So brace yourselves. Here we go. So we have man-eater, wolf laying down, afraid of water, yellow wolf, wolf's shoulder, chewing elk, going back up to the top. You know what you're looking at. Shaking hand. So you wonder if it's shaking hand or shaking hand. Here's a nice one. Here's the sunrise. Sounds rather profound, doesn't it? Painted lips. Dog fat. Gap in the woods. I would imagine he got this name because he led his people through a gap in the woods in order to escape somewhere. Then we have this one. And this was a guy who was a medicine man. He was a shaman. And generally speaking, you do not see this as his name. You see the Comanche word for it. And so you don't think about what this is. But he was he got quite a following near the end. We'll talk about this. He got quite a following for his prowess as a shaman. He could perform miracles, and even when his magic didn't always work, and people were shot and killed, despite the fact that they're not supposed to be, he still had quite a following. And then there's this guy. People would call him Buffalo Hump because they didn't like this name. Another word that you just kind of wonder, who called him this first? Who said, this is a good name for you? This last one, a big fat fall by tripping. This was a large guy. And so this was his name, a big fat fall by tripping. So he was a big guy, and apparently he tripped and fell, and so they said, hey, that sounds like a good name for you.
David?
Yes?
All the names that you shared with us for all these things.
Yes.
Classes, are they all men's names?
So, was it last week or the week before I had a short thing on women's names?
Okay.
But all of these, unless otherwise said, these are all men's names, yes. So yeah, those are some of the more interesting names. And these are names that I've just come across as I read. You read some of these books, you just come across them, and very often no comment is made about the name. Now, some of the more interesting names they do mention, but only that. For white people, for white society, they always try to come up with something different, like Buffalo Hump, rather than the erection that won't go down. So they came down with the Utes, and then they came out onto the plains, and they found that the horses loved the plains, and they thrived out on the plains. It was a perfect setting for them because it was much like where they originated back in Mongolia and the steppes of Asia. It fit. And so they also found that there's plenty of game out there. The buffalo are great to hunt, and so it was a good fit for the Comanche as well. The one problem that they had, of course, is that the Apaches were out there, and other tribes as well. But that was a rather minor problem for the Comanche, as since they were such great horsemen and fierce warriors, they made short work of the Apaches. And battle after battle, they would kill Apaches and basically replace them as the dominant force on the plains. And this became their new economic sphere out on the plains with the Spanish in Santa Fe and Taos in New Mexico. They became traders with the Spanish and hunters and kidnappers. basically. They had a deal with the Spanish that they would hunt down other tribes, the Apaches, the Navajos, and others, and they would capture their women and children. And the Spanish would buy them. Now the Spanish, openly, they would say that they're saving them from the brutes, the Comanches, and from the tortures that they would inflict. Of course, they liked rescuing women and children better than they did men. And the reason for that is they would very often use the women for themselves, for their own sexual pleasures, and they would use the children, they'd raise the children, for slaves. That was not what they were supposed to do, but that's what they did. And the Comanches knew it, and it was one of those open secrets. Because it made an awful lot of money for a lot of people, that's the way it worked. And one of the odd things too is that for the horses and donkeys that they would steal, very often they would steal from one town of the Spanish and sell it to another. And the town that was buying them were okay with that. The town that they were stealing from was not. And so the Spanish kind of had to get together on this, and there was a lot of complaints flying back and forth, but this went on for some time. The other thing about this whole transaction, this whole interaction between the Spanish and the Comanches that is remarkable is that in this relationship, it was the Comanches who were dominant, not the Spanish. The Spanish had intended, as they always did back in those days, to dominate all of the tribes. And so they, of course, forced some of them to work for them as semi-slaves. They coerced them into becoming Catholic. They were always working on the Apaches and the other Indian tribes in the area to become Catholic and to become subject to the King of Spain. They could not do that with the Comanches. The Comanches would have none of it. The Comanches basically were the ones calling the shots. And so as their trade developed and their relationship developed over the years, it was the Comanches who came out on top as the dominant force in the area, as they spread out onto the plains and they started interacting both with the settlements in southern Texas and the settlements in New Mexico, Santa Fe and Taos. Over and over again, it was the Spanish who would have to bend the knee to the Comanche, not the other way around. Now there were battles that would go back and forth, and sometimes the Spanish would inflict a serious defeat on the Comanches, but all in all, it was still the Comanches calling the shots. The Comanches still demanded gifts in order to trade. So when they had come into town, Taos in New Mexico was the main trading center, and they would come into town. The Comanches expected gifts, lots of gifts, and the Spanish complained. The towns way up there complained that they are bankrupting us with all of the gifts that they demand. And if they don't get their gifts that they are expected to get as something sort of like tribute, they start raiding, they start stealing, they plunder, they kill, they kidnap. And so they were forced to practically bankrupt themselves in order to please the Comanche. And then they would trade with them. And the protocols for trading were always Comanche protocols, not Spanish. The Spanish were the ones who had to be careful not to offend the Comanches, not the other way around. So it was an instance in which you have Europeans on American soil who were being dominated by the natives and not the other way around. It's one of the things that was brought out in this book on Quanah Parker. So the slave trade, as I mentioned, they would go around, and the Spanish were okay with this because, as I say, they were rescuing these poor captives and teaching them Christianity. So they would pay for these captives who would eventually, for the Spanish, become either just household slaves, sometimes sexual slaves, because they always paid more for the girls than they did for the guys. So that was for upwards of 100 years, this went on. One of the things, too, that the Comanches knew that the Spanish were playing the card that they were rescuing. And so the Comanches openly would be brutal towards these captives in front of everyone. They would rape women and let the Spanish know, if you do not pay for these captives, this is the kind of treatment that they will get. They were very brazen about that. So here is Comanche land, roughly speaking, 1740 to 1840. All of central and northern Texas into Oklahoma, Kansas, and the eastern part of New Mexico. So as I said, it kind of went back and forth. This is one particular Spanish victory around 1750. So they had a Grand Council, 1751, and they got an agreement by the Comanches to stop raiding and to be friendly towards the Spanish. And Spain, for the first time, recognized a Native American tribe as a sovereign nation. And then they developed their own protocol on how to go about trading back and forth. And again, this was protocol that was mainly dominated by the Comanche, not the Spanish. It was the Spanish who had to be polite. It was the Spanish who had to give gifts, not the Comanche.
Question?
Yes?
In the previous biograph you showed, you used the term unofficial slaves. Is that because the church had outlawed slavery in the Union?
You know, I'm not sure when exactly they had outlawed slavery. So I can't tell you exactly, but I know this, again, this is when they were purchasing or ransoming these captives, they were not to be ransomed to become slaves, officially speaking. Unofficially, they were. Yes?
What was the general fate of there must have been multiple half-breeds who were half Spanish?
Yes.
What happened to them?
So, among the Comanche, there were many, and I'm going to address this a little more, but it's been said by many authors will tell you that the Comanches were not racist in the least because they couldn't afford to be. And I'll get into that in just a second. So the Comanche trade network, very vast, and it's amazing. Again, when we talk about Comanche, we're not talking about a central government. No such thing. Even the clans, the individual clans, were not always very united. They were a distinct group who spoke the same language, but they were not in any way united. There was no chief over all the Comanche until the very end. So all of them could basically do as they pleased. But they did work together for their own economic interests. And so they developed this trading network. And it went not just with Spain. So Spain, they traded with New Mexico and in Texas. They traded with the British via the Mandans, Shawnees, and Cheyennes up north, because the British were up in Canada, northern area, and so they could trade with the British through other tribes. They traded with the French down in Louisiana, and then the U.S. once we got that, and they traded with the British in West Florida until the U.S. took that over too. And they were such good traders and so prosperous in that they became the ones who were selling guns and ammunition to the Spanish rather than the other way around. So here's a map of the trading network. So the Mandans were up here, and they traded with the British, and could trade then with Comanche. And here's St. Louis. Traders would come over, and down here, here's New Orleans, and of course, here's Taos and Santa Fe up here. Truly amazing network that was, again, there's no central control over it. It's everybody doing what they want in their own interest. So, there was a problem, though, with Comanches, and that is when you are a horse people, and many historians will note this, they had very low birth rates, because apparently riding a horse for days on end is not very good for a pregnant woman. And so there's often miscarriages were very common. So, to keep their population up, that's one of the reasons that they were so into kidnapping others. And so they would take in mostly younger women and children. The children could be perfectly white and become a member of the tribe once they went through the brutal initiation of becoming Comanche. And also, once they became a powerful entity, many individuals and small groups would want to be a part of that. It's always a popular thing if you have a powerful nation, a powerful group of people, others want to be a part of it, regardless of who that is. And so the Comanches grew in numbers, both from kidnapping and from just people wanting to join the tribe. Now, I haven't read anything about how people become a member of the tribe who voluntarily come to the Comanche. I'm not sure if there is an initiation for that or not. We know that if you are kidnapped as a child, you are brutalized, almost to the point of death sometimes, before you are allowed to become a member of the Comanche. But I'm not so sure what happens when a group of 10 or 20 Apaches comes and says, hey, we want to be a Comanche. And that sort of thing happened. Sometimes it was runaway slaves. Sometimes it was just people who were didn't have anything else going on in their lives and felt dispossessed in their own culture. Yes?
Just Googled that apparently prolonged horseback riding is bad for male fertility too.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. I wouldn't doubt. And so, so this happened so frequently that they brought in others to bolster their own numbers. That a comment was made by someone who knew the Comanches well, that by the early 1800s, there were few pure-blooded Comanches left. So, this is how you become a Comanche, when you are captured. Initially, and again, I'm giving this example as a generalized overview of how it happened, but each individual, I have to stress, was very different. How they would be treated, how they would survive, and some would not survive. But this is generally how it would go. They were whipped, they were beaten, and not just by the men. Sometimes it was more the women's job to beat them and whip them for the first few days that they are there. One of the worst in their celebrations, if they captured you as a young child after a raid on your town or your family or a group of people, they come back to their village and they're celebrating with the scalps of your loved ones. your father, your mother, your brothers or sisters. And so you are to join the celebration. They give you a pole with your loved one's scalp on it, and you are to dance and sing with them. And they make a note. They make sure that you are humiliated through this whole ordeal. Sometimes throwing rocks at you, hitting you with sticks, making sure that this is thoroughly unpleasant for you. So, at the end of a certain amount of time, and again, there's no distinct time limit for this. Sometimes it would last a few days. Sometimes, in some cases, if they didn't care for you too much and they didn't want to kill you, this could go on for years, where you were just a miserable, awful person to be picked on by everybody. But once it was done, you could be accepted as a member of the tribe. Now, you may initially be a slave for a while as a member of the tribe, or if you're lucky, you could replace someone who was killed in battle as the son or daughter that was killed and accepted into a family where you would be treated very well. Now, in some of what I've read, they'll say that if you are a white person or someone who is not at all Comanche, you could never become, say, the chief of a tribe. And you will always be known as a member of the tribe, but something of a second-class member. So, okay. And here is the scalp dance. And all of these are scalps up here. So, this went on for generations, dealing with the Spanish as basically the bully on the block that could push around the Spanish, make sure that the Spanish respect them. For everybody else who are more distant traders, they generally would treat them okay. The Apaches, of course, were generally the enemies, and some other tribes that were local that they would attack anytime they knew that they were nearby and kill them as they could. There was one tribe, the Kiowas, who were known to be allies with the Comanches. And off and on, other tribes may also be. But generally speaking, they cleared the plains for themselves and would raid and kidnap and kill because that was their way of life. It was not just something that they did of economic necessity. It was a way of life. So, in the 1830s, we have a new group who is now a threat to the Comanches. Comanches knew about the United States because they would trade with them, as was said, through Louisiana and the Florida Panhandle. And they were actually very impressed with American traders. The traders from the United States were wealthy, and they had lots of really good stuff to trade with the Comanches. So that was a good thing for the Comanches. But then in 1821, the Mexican Revolt, they kicked out the Spanish rulers. So now Mexico is independent. And Mexico is suffering, in Texas especially, because the Comanches are dominating them. So what do? To bolster their numbers, they invite people from the United States to come and settle in Texas. They really wanted the numbers as a buffer, mostly, for the Comanches. They wanted to develop Texas as a Mexican territory, and they wanted more people to fight the Comanches. So thousands of people from the United States came. The one thing that they would not do, generally speaking, is get between the Mexicans and the Comanches. They were more southern, for the most part, Texas, and let the Mexicans take the brunt of it. But as time went on, there were other things that were disrupting their trade. and that was, as we know, in the 1830s, when the United States were expelling the Cherokees and other tribes to go out to Oklahoma. That disrupted the tribes who were already there. And those tribes were part of the Comanche network. And so the Comanches were in trouble for this because they couldn't trade as they once did. And so this incited a number of battles, and it took some years before that to settle down. And let's see. And then, of course, we have the Texas Rangers. The Americans in Texas really knew that sooner or later they were going to become independent of Mexico. It was almost a foregone conclusion. Once you have more people from the United States in Texas than you have Mexicans, they were not going to be happy with the leadership in Mexico City. So there was the revolt. Texas is now independent, and it's now the people of the United States who were taking the brunt of the Comanches. And so this new organization, Texas Rangers, came about. And I imagine if they were putting an ad in the paper for an employment for the Texas Rangers, and if they were honest, it would be something like, wanted, young men foolish enough to come out and attack well-armed and very talented warriors out on the plains. You have very little pay, but we will provide all the guns and ammunition you need. You probably will not live through the first year, but you have free reign, almost, to kill as you like. People you see as outlaws or Indians. And they got a lot of people. A lot of young men who had nothing better to do in their lives thought this would be a great thing. I get to go kill people. I get to kill Indians. And sadly for many of them, they were, in the first few years, the Texas Rangers took it really hard. There was very little training or organization to it, and many of them did not last long against the Comanches. So there was a great raid on Texas, 1840, which is it was in retaliation for killing a number of chiefs and other Indians, probably about 30 or so, by the white people, which was in retaliation for other things going on. It was kind of a chain reaction of you kill some of us, we kill some of you, and the back and forth in these retaliations was pretty awful. At one point in 1840, after a number of defeats, the Comanches came and said, look, we want to have a peace with you. We want to settle this. And so the commander of the fort they were talking to said, that sounds good. First, you need to return all of the captives that you have taken from us. And at that time, this is 1840, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 white people who had been captured and being held by various Comanche bands. And so the Comanche chiefs who were there said, well, let us think about it. We'll come back in about 20 days and we'll tell you what our answer is. So in the meantime, they get together a bunch of soldiers in anticipation of these chiefs coming back. And they said, if we don't get our captives back, we're going to keep them until we do. So the chiefs came back, about 65 altogether with them. There were about 3 or 4 chiefs. And they apparently, and this is the eyewitness accounts, saying they were very haughty. They brought back 2 captives. And one of them was a Mexican, and he doesn't count. The other one was a 16-year-old girl. And this 16-year-old girl had basically her nose burnt off of her face.
Oh.
Her body was covered with bruises and burn marks.
Oh.
And they said, we're going to give you the captives back one by one. And you will pay for them. And that's how this is going to work. And so the captain, being prepared for this, said, no, we're going to keep you until all of our captives are returned. Of course, immediately, the chiefs hear this, they bolt for the door and try to escape. And so there's a big battle. Out of the 60-some-odd Comanche, about half of them were killed. In turn, they killed probably a dozen or so people at the fort, but about 30 were kept. When the Comanche hear that of this treachery, and this is the local band, they didn't have all 200, as I said, this is all spread out. 200 captives could not be controlled by any one chief, or even a couple of chiefs, or a few of them. But the local band had 13 captives who they immediately tortured to death in the most brutal ways that they could imagine. So that led to another series or rounds of attacks. The biggest raid of all in 1840, right after this, was a raid down through southern Texas all the way to the coast. And this is Buffalo Hump, by the way, who led this. Killing and stealing, they went all the way down to the coast, and there was a port, Linville, which is no longer a town, by the way. It's north of Corpus Christi, up the coast a ways. And it's right by Victoria. So they raided Victoria, they came to Linville, and that was a port city that had warehouses full of stuff. And the Indians loved this because there was a lot of fabrics and clothing that they would plunder. They stole a couple thousand horses and donkeys, and they plundered the warehouses and thought, this is great. We're now on our way. But on their way back, they were so loaded down with all of their plunder that they ran into large groups of Texans who were now very angry at being raided like this. So there was a battle, and a number of Indians were killed, but they eventually escaped as a whole and lost a lot of their plunder. Anyway, the treaty in 1844 was basically stop raiding our territories. So that was the agreement. This was the first time the Comanche actually agreed to something of a border, that we will stay within our bounds and you stay within yours. Of course, neither side were going to keep it, but at least it was a start. They also wanted free passage through to Mexico. If we can't raid you people, we're going to raid Mexico. And they did. Northern Mexico was a place that annually, for many years, and the Mexican people would even know, it's September. It's time for the Comanches to come down and raid. And they would, for year in and year out, do that. And of course, they would steal, they would capture people for their tribe to sell or to bring into their tribe. But anyway, so this was reaffirmed once Texas became part of the United States. This was reaffirmed as a territory or a treaty with the Comanche. So at this time, once Texas becomes part of United States territory, they thought it would be a good idea to have a string of forts along something of the boundary line. And so this was the forts, all up and down here. It's interesting when you think about what you know of American history and how the United States annexed Texas, and you see the maps. Okay, Texas is now part of the United States, but really, it was only this part of Texas. The rest of this was Comanche land or other tribes that you're taking your life in your hand, going out there or trying to settle. And one of the peculiarities of American history, of the West, in many countries, the history of, say, Canada, it's always the law that goes first out into a territory. For American history, the United States, it's not the law that goes first. It's the individuals, the people who want to gain free land, the farmers, the ranchers. They go first, long before any law goes out there, and usually without permission. And that's the way it happened with Texas as well. But anyway, so the Comanches at this time were a wealthy people. They still had their trading networks, and they had developed into a culture that was becoming more and more stratified, because with that wealth, you have some who were very wealthy and some who were still trying to make it, even though you think of Native American tribes as being something of a commune where everybody shares everything. But in this instance, because there is so much wealth to be had, the Comanches became as I say, became stratified to becoming, there's the wealthy families, and then there's the poorer families, and then there's the young men who are trying to make it. And so, if you were a young Comanche wanting to make it in your tribe, what you start out with is borrowing horses from the wealthy. And then you go on raids to steal horses, and when you come back, you give most of those horses to the person who loaned you the horses to begin with. And it takes years to accumulate wealth in this way. And once you establish yourself, then you start loaning out horses to other young men, and you make it, you acquire your wealth that way. And then you can retire like this guy. Mountain of Rocks. When George Catlin, who I spoke of last week, did this portrait, he said, "This is the largest Indian I've ever seen. This guy is just huge." He was a retired Indian. He had thousands of horses, and he loaned them out to young men. And those young men would go on raids and steal other horses, and he would get the larger share of the cut of the horses that were stolen. But he didn't have to do it himself anymore. He sat around and grew very large. Now, when I first saw this, and saw this is a big guy, his name is Mountain of Rocks, I thought, well, it must be because he's a very large guy. So it reminded someone of a large mountain of rocks. Well, as it turns out, that's not why he got his name. I'm a bit disappointed, to tell you the truth. I thought that would be a good catch. But apparently, as a younger man, he led his braves through a cave in this large mountain. That was a very rocky place. So he escaped from some enemies at this time by leading them through this cave. And so that's how he got his name, Mountain of Rocks. Then we come to the decline of the Comanche. As we know, all Native American tribes are very susceptible to the diseases from Europe, smallpox being the worst. But through the 1840s and 50s, the smallpox and cholera wiped out roughly half of the tribe in Texas. And as the years went by, the Texas Rangers were becoming more and more effective, still taking a heavy toll among themselves, killing a lot of rangers, but the Texas Rangers were becoming rather effective at killing Comanches. By the 1860s, the United States is now starting to look down on the Comanches going into Mexico to attack and raid down there. So they start hindering that whole process. And many of the trading partners of the Comanches are now being put on reservations and can no longer trade with the Comanches. And of course, the buffalo herds are dwindling too around this time. And this is the 1860s into the 1870s. So these are the various causes of the decline of the Comanche. The Medicine Lodge Treaty, 1867. They are given a reservation in Oklahoma. They want, the United States government says, we will take care of you in Oklahoma. And there's a large piece of land. We want you to settle down. The buffalo herds are dwindling, as you well know. You will no longer be able to sustain yourself out on the prairie. So we will take care of you. And some of them thought this was a good idea, not all of them by any means. Some of them thought this was a good idea, and so they show up. And much to the surprise of the people running the reservation, nobody planned for them showing up. And so there was no food for them. And so the Comanche, as many learned over the years, that the reservations in the first few years of this whole system were horribly corrupt. The people who were running that system were very often the worst crooks out there, and would steal from the Comanches, would buy rancid food, and basically just pocket the difference. And aside from that, it was horribly inefficient as well, where one part of the agency wouldn't know what the other one was doing, or who's supposed to do what. So it was, in addition to being corrupt, it was just poorly led. And so, because of that, all these thousands of Native Americans, Comanches, waiting to be fed the promised food that was supposed to be delivered, they start raiding the other tribes there in Oklahoma, because all the other tribes by this time are settled farmers. The Comanche hated that idea. And so they thought, settled farmers are great for us to raid, because they have lots of good stuff. We can steal their horses, their cattle, and their food. And so that's what they started doing, raiding the local tribes there in Oklahoma. And this is very near the end of the Plains Indians. But they still have to survive, and they still have hope that something will happen, that they will survive there out on the plains. And this latest outrage led them once again to take to the plains and start, if there isn't a lot of buffalo, there are a lot of settlers to attack and plunder. And so that's what they did. And then we come to this story. Cynthia Ann Parker. She was captured at the age of 9 by Comanches. As she grew up, we don't really know how her story came about. We know that she was captured in a raid on a particular fort by a couple of families out on the plains of Texas, where I believe 2 or 3 were killed, others were injured, and she, along with a few others, were taken. So she's captured. She grows up, and she marries the Comanche chief, Nocana, and has 3 children with him. She is then recaptured in a raid by some soldiers. Her husband is killed at that time. Her 2 older boys escape and get back to Comanches. And she and her baby, Prairie Flower, there's a nice girl name for you. She and her baby are captured. And she immediately, in this whole raid, something interesting that women are known to do. Native American women are told, if the white people are coming after you, and are going to shoot at you, and you know that they're tracking you down, what you do is you either stop and show them, don't run, just show them that you are a woman. And one of the ways that you do that is to open up your top and show them that you have breasts. And then they know that you're a woman. And apparently she did that. And so anyway, she knew she could still remember some English, and she told them who she was, basically to keep them from killing her. And so she was taken back to her family, who were, of course, overjoyed that she was still alive. Unfortunately for everyone, she was so thoroughly, and this is 24 years, by the way, this is 1860. She knew very little English. She spoke, interestingly, she spoke Comanche and Spanish.
Wow.
Because of the trade with the Spanish was so extensive and important. She learned Spanish. So she came back with her family, and they learned very quickly that she was miserable. She missed, first of all, her 2 sons are still with the Comanche, and she missed them terribly. She was very upset that her husband was killed because she loved him. So the rest of her life, and to make matters worse, after a few short years, her daughter died of some illness. And then she was basically pretty miserable through the rest of her life, a short life, and wanted to go back and tried to escape on a number of occasions. And anytime she would meet with someone who may be going out to the plains, she would beg for them to take her with them, because she missed being with the Comanches. So she died of some illness about 10 years later or so. A very lonely, sad woman. So a tragedy in both captures. She was most likely brutalized when she was first captured at the age of 9 or 10. We're not really sure exactly how old she was, but almost certainly she was raped, even at that age. That was a very common thing for Comanches, Native Americans, to do. As she grew up, she became a Comanche, and that's what she knew. And she loved it, and she would perform even among white people. She lived on a farm, and she would perform little rituals that the Comanche would do, and she would chant the Comanche rituals and set up her own little shrine or whatever it was that their religious rituals entailed. But yeah, very sad story. And this is Cynthia and Prairie Flower. I want you to notice 3 things in this picture that really strike me. First of all, look at her eyes. Some of the most forlorn look you'll ever see in her face. Secondly, this is the 1800s. This is a white woman, and she is breastfeeding, and someone took a photograph of that. That's probably the only photograph you'll ever see of a white woman in the 1800s breastfeeding. But she was perfectly okay with that. The third thing is, I want you to look at her hands. These are the manliest hands I've ever seen on a woman. The reason that she has such powerful hands is because she would spend her time tanning hides, scraping the fat off of these hides and working them. Apparently it is not easy work to do, and she would do this day in and day out. Just amazingly powerful hands I'm sure she had.
Does she have pock marks on her face?
No, that's the photograph. That's just the stuff of the photograph. And this, Quanah Parker, is her eldest son. That's the one on your handout. He barely escaped in that raid. He was about 15 or so. He and his younger brother escaped and went back to his tribe. And so he became an orphan with his brother. And one of the interesting things, too, when you are the son of a chief. You are treated well in your tribe. You have special status. And again, we have the idea that everybody is sort of equal, and probably more so than in most societies. But still, if you are the son of a powerful family, your father is the chief, you have special status in that tribe. If you are an orphan, even if you were the son of a chief, your special status is gone. And he relates how he was not treated so well anymore, and sometimes people were reluctant to feed him. He had no parents. And he was, and here's another thing, many authors will tell you that there is no racism among the Comanche because they needed the people in their tribes. I think there's always racism in every society, especially among young people. If you can see a distinct difference in one person, they're going to pick it out because young people like to do that sort of thing. Anyway, he mentions as an adult that when he was a 15-year-old orphan in the tribe, one of the reasons he was not treated as well anymore was because he was an orphan. The other reason he was not treated as well anymore was because he was a half-breed. Now, they're not going to kick him out of the tribe. They're not going to let him starve. They are going to take care of him, but he does not have the status that he once had. Anyway, he proved himself. He was a great physical specimen, and so he proved himself in battle, he proved himself on the hunt, and that was good. That is what is most important as a Comanche man, that you are a great hunter and that you are a brave warrior fighting against your enemies. And so, an interesting story, and this is where we come to the medicine man, the shaman, who was named Coyote Vagina. He wanted to attack the whites, and he's preparing for this particular battle against this fort at Adobe Walls, 1874. And he's working himself up into this great battle, and he's convinced everybody who's coming along with him anyway. Some didn't really go with it, but some of them thought, this guy knows what he's doing. He's a miracle man. And so he painted his whole body yellow, and he told everyone else, paint yellow your whole body. I'm going to go completely naked except for my headdress. And so they rode to attack Adobe Walls. If you are with me, and if you are pure, and you paint yourself yellow, the bullets will not penetrate you. We will succeed because of this. Well, it was an abject failure in every sense of the word. And many were killed. One of the things that they found, to their dismay, is that this small settlement that they were attacking had buffalo hunters there. And they had these new rifles. And these new rifles could shoot at an amazing distance. And so once the attack ultimately failed, they rode off. We'll travel about a half a mile. That should be good enough. And we'll consult as to what we should do. And as they were out there, half mile away, their comrades started dropping, even when they couldn't even hear the sound of a gun. Because if there's a wind blowing at all, or if there's any noise, the bullet will hit there before the sound does. And so they were shocked, they were stunned, and so they go off a little further, about 3/4 of a mile, and then they're together consulting. Once again, bam, somebody right in front of you drops, and you don't even hear the sound of the gun. And they go off even further and find that the bullets still reach upwards of a mile. And they just could not believe this medicine, this new magic that the white people had. And so it was a terrible defeat for them, this attack on Adobe Walls. But they were going to continue because here it is, Isatai. That's the medicine man's name. something you don't want to say to a Comanche, I suppose. So we're coming to the end of the Comanches as a free tribe out on the plains. This is the last campaign, the Red River War, 1874 to 1875. It was really just 1874 were the battles, and they were all just small skirmishes for the most part. Headed by Ronald Mackenzie, and it is R-A-N, not R-O-N. A little different spelling there. It was, as I said, they were all small engagements, but what they did, even though they couldn't make the Comanches stop and fight a fixed battle, they always escaped with just a few losses. But what they lost, they could not replace, and that was their horses, their equipment, their teepees. Sometimes they were startled in the middle of the night or early in the morning and attacked, and they had to leave and leave lots behind. And that's stuff that they just could not afford to leave. And so they came to the point in 1875 where they had to go back to the reservations. And there's Ranald Slidell Mackenzie. Sad story, this guy, a great commander in the field, a very hard-nosed, straight-laced guy who expected 100% from all of his soldiers and very unforgiving for failure. In later life, he had some mental condition and went stark mad. So here's the Red River War. The battles, here's adobe walls up here, and then just a string of battles through the rest of the year. And so Quanah Parker led what was left of the Comanche back to Fort Sill, and they were going to be on the reservations from that time on. He actually did very well for himself on the reservation. He was a celebrity, being the great warrior, and he was invited to Washington, D.C. on a number of occasions, and people, white people around him absolutely loved him as a celebrity. So here is Quanah Parker on the reservation with one of his wives. And we're going to take a look at his house. It's really something. 2 of his 8 wives. He had 18 children altogether, plus he adopted 7 more. And this is the Star House.
Whoa.
This house was built for him by the local ranchers who loved him. And this, I'm not talking about other Native American ranchers, I'm talking about white people. So he could raise his very large family there. I understand it's in a rather dilapidated state right now, and they're trying to raise money to fix it up. And he was such a celebrity that they even had him in the movies.
Huh?
The bank robbery of 1908. And by the way, he was a good guy, not a bad guy in this movie. So here is, in Oklahoma, the Kiowa Comanche Apache reservation. And the Comanche flag. So today there are approximately 17,000 Comanche, although imagine that not many of them are pure-blooded Comanche, whatever that may be. But only about 7,000 of them live on the reservation. I understand. Any questions, comments? Yes?
The thing I have never understood, guns I get, it's the ammunition. Is it easy to make ammunition? Where are they?
I believe it is. Especially, well, if you go back to the days when you have a musket and you have a round ball and the powder, Native Americans were very good at making the balls. So if you have lead, they would have their own forges and melt down the lead into the little balls so that they could shoot. Getting the powder was a little more difficult. That's not something they could make, but they were very good at providing their own bullets that way. Yes?
Actually, in Bernal Diaz's book, the history of the conquest of New Mexico, or whatever he mentions that the local Aztecs were very impressed when southern men had themselves lowered down in baskets inside volcanoes because there were deposits of silver.
Right. Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned racism in Parker's case being prevalent among the younger people. I find it's more prevalent among the older people.
And you know, I'm just saying what I had read about, you know, Quanah Parker and what he had said later in life, that he was somewhat picked on because he was a half-breed. So, yeah, I wouldn't know much beyond that.
Or I'm used to that.
Okay. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I almost finished on time this time. So. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Next week, the Hopi Indians. Next week will be the last. The Hopi Indians, and this is a peaceful tribe. So it'll be interesting to see that.
Surprising they're still alive. Yeah.